My official project title is Exploring Lilith as a Feminist Figure and Using Fiction as a Source for Theology. I began working on it in late summer 2017. I initially intended to write a novella or a short novel, using the story of Lilith to examine the battle against the patriarchy, and in addition, because I am using a theological figure, I intended this project to show that fiction can be used as a source for studying theology, both in the writing of it and the reading of it. What I have for you now, at the tail end of this 2-year project, is a documentary which culminates the majority of my research, and my novel in progress, that is an outlined chapter summary and 3 chapters that represent specific parts of the story that I was asked to identify. So I begin with I begin with the documentary, which I have posted of my cast and my star of Lilith, Mary Adamowski. I intensified Dr. Cloden's Mystery of Evil course last spring, so 2018, and we decided that I would do this sort of side project to assist in my research for this major project that I present today. For context of my story, I will show the first about 4 minutes of the documentary, which shows the narrative of Lilith, and that is what I based my novel on. It is on YouTube if you are interested in seeing the entirety of it, and has gathered about over 11,000 views since last April. So on to the actual project. I separate that into 3 major parts, which I refer to as the rough draft, the full draft, and the current draft. The rough draft was just about getting my ideas onto the page, those ideas coming from an older story plot that I had written down many years ago in one of my notebooks, and the idea of Lilith coming from this sculpture that I saw a couple years before I started writing by Kiki Smith. And through this introduction to the sculpture, I was introduced to the story of Lilith, and I couldn't quite let go of it, just as I couldn't quite let go of this story idea in which there's a world before the real world where you are taught to hunt and kill monsters or demons, which plays into the overarching plot line of the novel. So I started writing in August 2017 in preparation for an advanced fiction course I took with Professor Maggie Anderson. This draft covered the section of my novel from the introduction to Lilith to her introduction to the wilderness, which was this place of the garden, or the Garden of Eden, that these shadow creatures dwelled, and the shadow creatures being these demonic monster sort of things, and they're evil. It's a whole thing. I was able to send this to her and other students in that class for a workshop discussion as part of that course, and it was very well received, so I had confidence in it, and I took it to Dr. Warren Green and Professor Anthony Suarez-Abraham to discuss it further as my distinction project. After that, I went into the full draft, which I wrote in July and August of 2018, and that is where all of my obstacles came into play. I was unable to write in June due to some mountainous personal issues, and I had to have a draft ready for them by the end of August because, as Dr. Green said, I did spend the fall semester abroad in London, and if you are unfamiliar with that program, it does involve a semester-long project which was unrelated to Lilith and therefore wedged a huge block of time into my working on this project in a reasonable amount of time. So I came back, had more personal issues, and had to deal with that in my non-existent free time. Went to Dr. Green and Professor Suarez-Abraham to get their notes on the full draft, which, pointed out where is it? I'm so sorry. We discussed the lengthening of the project from novella to full novel, and how I, as a Christian writer, ran into unintended supersessionism telling a Jewish story. I ended up changing names and certain character dynamics to avoid this, as well as to avoid connotations with other stories and characters from the Torah. Which brings me to the current draft, which I wrote this semester, implementing the aforementioned changes and others to truly flesh out the story as it deserved and needed. So we agreed upon a full outline chapter summary, as I mentioned before, and 3 major chapters, which included the inciting incident, the crisis, and the revelation, as these important elements that I needed to identify within my story. And speaking of what I wrote, I do have a reading for you all. This is from the first chapter. It explores Lilith and the introduction to the world I created and most of the characters. At this point, she is experiencing a sort of ritual that brings her into womanhood. They were all there. Miss Heather, head of household, at the head of the table, and the girls by age. Grace next to Lilith's seat, which was to the left of Miss Heather, Emma next to Kayla's seat on the right, and Daisy next to her. The rest of the table was empty, except for many more students who had not been there for years since the garden's population had dwindled. Lilith set the plate in front of Heather and pushed through it with a knife. She delicately transferred the slices to each plate and sat in her place. Heather took a bite. "You've done well," she said. Lilith smiled. "Go on now, recite." Kayla slipped back into the kitchen. Lilith took a breath. The story of the garden as they had all learned it growing up in the girls' house. Many years ago, the gardener planted seeds across the land. He tended to his plants and invited animals to join him for what seemed like eternity. But even the immortal grew tired. He surveyed his life's work, the greenery, the flowers, the fruit and vegetables that grew from the ground and in trees, the animals that helped him pollinate, fertilize, and eat, the pond at the center which watered the plants, and the ocean at the end of the land where he created new plants and animals based in that water. He had everything and nothing at all. So he created other gardeners like him, and when he taught them well enough how to tend to the garden, he left to create a new place, a bigger place where more gardeners could live with them as they grew and increased in number so quickly. They eagerly awaited word of the world to come. It took some time, but he made a whole world much faster than the garden and returned to invite his first people to live with him. The gardener explained to them that they would have to complete their lives in the garden before he could release their souls to the next world. The first people were already old and tired, as the gardener was when he first made them. The next day they went to him and explained that they had done all they could in the garden and were ready to live in the world to come. The gardener agreed to let them come and revealed a special tool that would transport them. He released their souls from their bodies, which returned to the earth of the garden, while the souls left for the next world. And it is for that moment which we wait. "Very good, Lilith," Heather said. The younger girls clapped. "Come, eat the bread." Lilith settled in her seat and ate. Kayla returned from the kitchen with a tall glass of brown liquid. She gave it to Heather, who slid it across the table to Lilith. "Now, by drinking this, you will truly become a woman tonight. Are you ready?" Lilith looked from Heather to Kayla, who nodded, and then to the glass. The liquid was the color of dry dirt. She swallowed the last of her manna bread. The glass was warm, as was the liquid down her throat. The drink coated her insides with cinnamon and thickness. She coughed. Morning hit Lilith hard. Everything hurt. She was hot and nauseous, and her legs felt sticky. She sat up in bed and pushed the sheets down to her feet. Blood covered her sheets, her nightgown, her inner thighs. She screeched. The girls in the rooms on either side of her woke up with a start. Heather heard it from down the hall and burst out of her door. Kayla stuck her head out into the hallway. Lilith's door slammed into the wall when she opened it. "I'm dying! I'm dying!" "Lilith, calm down," Heather cooed. But the blood!" Kayla arrived at Lilith's door with a bright red robe and matching towel folded between her arms. "It's time for purification, that's all." "You're a woman now," Heather said. She beamed as Lilith followed Kayla down the stairs. As they disappeared through the basement door, she clapped her hands, and the girls watching from their bedrooms scurried to get dressed for breakfast. In a room Lilith never noticed when she visited the nurse in the basement before, she now stood shivering and naked in the corner. Kayla poured near boiling water into a stone tub in the middle of the room. Bowl after bowl, the tub filled with water and the room filled with steam. She waited for the ripples to still and waved Lilith over. Lilith clenched her teeth as she sunk into the water. She yelped when Kayla poured another bowl of water over her head. "Can't you make it any cooler?" "The heat helps. If you make it through this, you can make it through anything. Women have to be strong. Men have to fight the shadows, but we have to fight ourselves. Talk yourself through it." Her skin reddened under the water. The redness crept up to her shoulders as she breathed through gritted teeth. She pushed her words out. Why do we have to fight? Kayla paused. Our fighting is different. We have to keep our homes safe because we'll have our babies until they can talk. Then they'll come here. But you know how the war is. The shadows are trying to kill us, trying to take the garden away from us. The gardener meant it for us, not them, so we all have to fight in our own way. If a shadow gets into your house, you'll have to kill it. Lilith clenched her jaw. That's the only real fighting you'll have to do, Kayla continued. And you shouldn't have to worry about it because our husbands are out on the front line taking down every shadow they can find. But you'll bleed like this every month. You need to fight through the pain and exhaustion to keep your home in top shape for when your husband returns. If you're lucky, you'll have lots of babies and you won't bleed as often. I don't want lots of babies. I don't even want any. It's your duty, Lilith. All of us have to do it for the garden. Kayla's firmness hit Lilith like a slap, backhanded and bruising. Sometimes, like right now, she wished she could just forget the garden, live alone in the wilderness. But then she remembered the shadows and the soldiers, and that she'd die out there. She'd run out of food or be killed for being a moving object without a uniform, or killed for whatever reason the shadows attacked humans. That's what Heather always told them. That's why staying inside the perimeters of the garden was so important, she told them. Survival is the most important thing. But it wasn't survival for them, it was survival for the sake of the garden. What will my husband be like, she asked. Oh, I'm sure he'll be handsome. Will he be nice? You know, when I met my husband, he was very good. He respects the garden, which is the most important thing. He will help me uphold our duties to the garden. That's all we can ever ask for. She poured another bowl of water over Lilith's shoulders. Lilith squeezed her eyes shut, but as she did, she noticed something dark in the corner of the white-tiled room. It was blurry and black, and it moved swiftly. But it was gone by the time Lilith opened her eyes again. She looked frantically around the room and splashed Kayla as she threw her body against the far side of the tub. What's wrong? Stop that! Sit still! No, I thought I saw something, Lilith whispered. Kayla's head disappeared below the edge of the tub. Lilith leaned over to look at her. Her face was contorted, and she groaned in such pain only a whisper of sound came out. Kayla? Lilith whispered. Kayla screamed. Tears dripped down her cheeks, companioned by the water that had splashed into her hair and on her clothes. Lilith climbed out of the tub. She slipped along the tile as she scrambled for a towel and towards the door. She flung it open, setting it into the wall with a thud, and raced toward the stairs. She looked down the basement hallway. The lights in the nurse's office were out, but Heather would be right upstairs. So, obviously the connection between my major, English writing, and my minor, theology, is that I'm writing a novel about a theological figure. But there's also the idea of mixing the explicit with the implicit when it comes to writing a religious fiction piece. For example, the full draft included characters with names from the Torah, and there was once a prologue which mimicked Genesis. Implicitly, I use numeric symbolism and other religious symbolism in my story that matches important numbers in Jewish tradition. I had to choose which parts of my research I would represent in my world, and in my novel, I created a theology for this world based both on Jewish tradition and on my own ideas. And I think the most important part is that it's not just a novel intended for those who will understand those underlying religious ideas, but I wanted to make it a story that can also be approached by a Gentile or altogether non-religious audience. I wanted to write both a good story and one that could be approached from a theological perspective. So that's that. Thank you for attending this presentation. I hope I have sparked interest in you in Lilith, my documentary, the rest of my novel, and I encourage you to explore theology through fiction, either revisiting something like, bless you, The Chronicles of Narnia, or analyzing a film, as I did with Professor Suarez Abraham in his religion and film class, and I'm sure he has recommendations for you, or something. Thank you again for your time. Do
we have any questions we'd like to address? We have several experts in the room. We could talk creative writing, we could talk theology, we could talk theater, we could talk all sorts of things. We've got lots of people in the room. So is there someone like to start?
Yes.
You know, I have to ask this, ma'am.
Yeah.
What does this have to do with suffering?
Well, that's the writing process.
What does it have to do with suffering?
Yeah, I mean, the underlying pulse of the story has a lot to do with suffering in the sense of not accepting the status quo,
Mhm.
moving away from a norm, and all of that costs something.
Right.
So, obviously,
Yes.
go for it.
So I think that Lilith as a figure and her story is a great representation of the suffering of womanhood in a male-dominated world. And in the original story, she flees. She rejects Adam and finds a better life for herself. In my story, spoilers, she still leaves and tries to find a better way for herself, but the patriarchy and the status quo defeats her. She is unable to remove herself from suffering, and does become Eve and becomes this, in the theology, becomes the ideal woman. Yes, Jermaine?
How do you deal with the issue that you made, that God proclaimed that if she doesn't come back, 100 of her children will be killed every day? How do you deal with that kind of in your novel?
In my novel,
Do you deal with that?
I
at all?
don't quite touch on it, no. I touch on this idea that she has knowledge of the garden, that the leader of the garden, not the gardener, but that he does not have, and that's sort of a battle there that occurs and ends up in her death because he cannot accept it.
Was that fact found in what scripture? Is it in the Torah, or was it that God proclaimed that this was?
I believe
to be
that was
done?
the alphabet of Ben Sira.
Pardon?
The alphabet of Ben Sira.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Did you just get to the story and not be able to let it go? Like, I mean, did you read about that? Like, I'm assuming there's general knowledge of Adam and Eve, right? We sort of know that that's a story. And we may disagree with that story. We may disagree. I've come across a few students who don't actually know Adam and Eve, but we'll assume that's general knowledge. And then this Lilith, like, just throws it all up in the air. I mean, that's sort of, it's a little bit like finding out your parents were married to other people, but, and you never knew.
Right.
Yeah. Is there something there that you just couldn't?
Well, if we go to I love the sculpture, and I love that, when she is presented, she's like eye to eye with the audience. So I did not post a picture of her face on, but she really, she does not let you go, and I love how fierce she is, and the story was just so interesting to me, and I've always had this sort of underlying interest in theology and religious studies. So hearing this new information and reading this story really just kind of, grabbed my interest. And
Did it explain something to you? Like a question that you didn't realize you had? I mean, for me, it's like, oh, that explains Adam everything. I get it now. He's missing Lilith because, Eve is, So, I mean, that makes sense to me.
Yeah, another thing that fascinates me is that she was labeled demonic.
yeah.
Yeah.
And is that because she rejected
Adam?
patriarchy,
Right.
domination, or whatever?
Well, the formation of this story came from, male Torah scholars who were looking for this explanation to the double creation story in Genesis. And, men, not to offend any men in the room, but there's this sort of Adam is the man, and Adam was the first, and he should be the best. So there's this idea that, if she was going to reject him, that must mean there's something wrong with her, not Adam.
I don't know, but by even offering that other character, I think that complicates it. You know what I mean? It's
Yeah,
not,
definitely.
It's not that it is Adam, but that there is this there are alternative readings. The possibility of alternative readings supplants the idea of patriarchy being the only reading. I'm sorry. I mean, you were going to give a much better answer.
The very common pattern of demonizing
Yeah.
those in history who attempt to offer a different
Absolutely.
perspective or to assert their equality. Mary Magdalene, of course, there's zero evidence that she was a prostitute. And
Still
any,
witch trials, right.
you know, the Pope decided to label her that.
Okay.
There you go.
There you go, there you have it.
In terms of Torah study, pre-patriarchy, it was the patriarchy that was doing the studying, but there are two creation of Eve in the Torah, in the Bible. And you have to figure out, if you're going to dive into that and you're going to take it literally, if it's literally, you're in trouble because there's two Eves, right? And it's translated as Eve because that's how it translates. So she's created this way, and then she's also created that way. What happened to this one? Who was this one? There's no accounting of her being dead or dying in child creation, right? She's just there and then she isn't. It's like light. Light is created twice on 2 different days. What's the difference between this light and that light? So
I love that analogy.
you sit together and you figure out, okay, what's God telling us in this story? And so Lilith is a made-up version. She becomes negative because why, if she was positive, why wouldn't she be around? So it isn't just patriarchy, it's logical, not necessarily good logic, but it's a logical way of trying to explain how these traditional stories came. And it's similar to, but completely different, the way we deal with the Noah story, which is a kid's story about rainbows until you read it, and it's about massive death and wet and ick and horror. So it's not, I agree that there's a large patriarchal bent to this study, but all the interesting stuff that's written about Lilith in the last 20 years is written by women.
Obviously, there's a kind of othering that happens, right?
Right.
You know, so you're bad. You gotta go. But at the same time, that othering is really the vehicle for her own freedom, because she couldn't be free if she just stayed in place.
Right.
So displacing her or othering her or demonizing her in some ways is her passport to her own self-realization. So could you say something about that?
Sure. I think it's, an idea of, or an idea against conformity, because you're not necessarily free and you're not yourself if you're conforming to what the leader has to say. So in her case, it was, Adam wanted her to submit, and Adam wanted her to be his helper and not any budge in equalizing it or making it the other way around. And so her otherness allowed her not to conform to that and allowed her to feel freer in not submitting to him.
Or her otherness or her sense of equality,
Yeah.
right? I mean, it's we often assign otherness with marginality or otherness with vulnerability or the lesser voice, but actually it is her equalness that allows her to take herself from, right? She disappears when it takes her from the garden.
Yeah, I would add to that. I couldn't agree with you more. At least in my reading of it. But this is not this romantic othering that goes out into. There is this real existential crisis and death that Lilith is dealing with, I would argue, in this process of trying to break free from the weight of this tradition that she's been forced upon. And that's how I would think of her death, where, there has to be this existential death where she literally breaks free from everything in the past and is able to, well, you and I might disagree with the rebirth part, but the rebirth, what's that?
And me too, which I think is interesting,
Yeah.
sorry to interrupt, that we have 3 different interpretations of a project that we oversaw, that I think the ending might actually mean this. That may not be
That's a
what
big
Mia
no.
means at all, and it's not what we shared this way too.
Yeah.
I just have a question about the film that you
Yes.
created, the video. The camera angle, frequently you had major characters, the camera seemed to be under them looking up, especially, of course, with God. I mean,
Right.
God was like this, but so was Eve. Eve I noticed more than anything, and then and Adam, and then other characters it was straight on,
Mhm.
like with Lilith, it was eye to eye, you might say.
Right.
Was there any meaning that you had, or purpose that you had?
Yes, there was a lot of meaning and purpose in the way I filmed and went about casting for that. I could have decided to make God a woman. I could have made the angels a mix or all women, but I very specifically wanted Lilith to be the only woman besides Eve. And I specifically wanted, there was also a lot of down shots for all the other characters besides God. Some of the looking up had to do with height, because I'm not as tall as my friends. But definitely there was a very specific choice with looking up at God as the all-powerful. Yes.
The standard academic creative writing type question is about influences,
Yeah.
and you did mention a few at the end, some recommendations for further reading. But I'm particularly curious, both in the way you were talking, you talked in the past, when you were starting the project, and the way you introduced it, and the way both of your advisors are talking about it, that there seems to be this trepidation, like oh my God, what are we going to do with this? What's going to happen with this? How do people read this? So I'm wondering, in some ways, in your writing process, particularly your creative process, what sorts of things, maybe particular texts, even films, interpretations you were looking to avoid? If there were cautionary examples, or if there were even novels and fiction you read and say, like, if it was ever like, not like this is what I'm trying to avoid.
Right.
That people do when they do either, religious story as fiction or anything like that.
There were a number of short stories and articles that I read about Lilith, of which I cannot remember names, but I can get them to you later if you wish.
You don't remember?
Okay. No, I do. There was one in particular that had Lilith and Eve form a friendship, and that was very interesting. They're, in my own writing, not necessarily influenced by anything, but my initial thoughts were to connect everything religiously and make it explicitly religious. And with the notes from Dr. Green in particular on that, was where I ran into supersessionism and blood libel. And I did not want to include that, so that's where the name changes came in. And, just one in particular was that the leader of the garden was named Abraham. And there was this idea of, like, sacrificing the children for a better good, and that was, but that did not read well, especially to a Jewish reader, and one who has these connotations with these other names that I may not necessarily have immediately, but having all those religious names, he had thoughts of, like, where is she going with this? How is she going to tie in that story specifically, when I wasn't necessarily doing that? So, yeah. Emma,
I'm going to call a halt. You've got one more, and we're really over time, and I just want to make sure we can get to the 2:30 session, but I have one more question. Is this a quick one, and then a really quick response?
I mean, I know Mia, so we can talk about it.
We're going to talk. All right, you promise me you'll ask her afterwards? All right, I'd love to think of the conversation going forward after this. I'd like to take just one more minute and say once again how grateful we are for her readers, how delighted I am that they have at least two different interpretations of her work. That makes me, as English professor, so very happy. But that there's been so much care, work, concern, writing, rewriting. I just want to thank you all again for that work.
Thank you.